Hey there, good people of the world. It's the Big Heavy, and this is a bit of a good news, bad news kind of video. Bad news is, if you're interviewing for a job, you've probably been doing it wrong. The good news is, most other people are also doing it wrong. And I'm here today to share some of my experience of 20 plus years interviewing people as part of my role in large consulting companies, large corporations, and get you on the path of righteousness so you can crush your interviews. Thankfully, these tips are relatively easy to understand and hopefully easy to implement. Ultimately will lead you to some success in your job hunt. So without any further ado, let's get into it. This video is targeted at what the HR folks would call a behavioral interview. So this is interviews about you, about your experience, the classic, tell me about yourself, tell me about a time when, I see on your resume you did X, tell me about that type of interview. These tips are specific to the later rounds of the interview process. So when you're talking to someone like me, I'm usually the final round. I'm, one of a couple or three people that'll make a decision on whether or not you get hired. And you usually talk to me after you have an initial HR screen. So that's what I would call the can you walk and chew gum at the same time kind of interview. Not that anyone will ask you to do that, but you're speaking to someone from human resources or talent management or whatever fancy term the organization has come up with. And their job is to make sure that, number one, you can speak reasonably concisely and you're a reasonable human being. Number two, whatever you've put on your resume kind of matches what you talk about. And number three, that your baseline qualifications are relevant to the job. And I think there's maybe an art to passing that initial HR screen. I'm not really going to talk about that today, although a lot of these interview tips you could apply to those initial HR screen type interviews. So the first thing I want to share with you is probably where things start to go wrong is just understanding the basic purpose of an interview and what somebody like me is trying to ascertain when they're speaking to you during the course of an interview. And it's really simple. I think people overcomplicate this quite a bit. I'm basically trying to answer two questions when I interview you. Number one is, frankly, do I want to work with you? Are you somebody that's interesting, that's engaging, that seems to have the right skills, and brings the right type of personality and interest and excitement to the job, in that, I wouldn't mind rubbing elbows with you on a daily basis. I wouldn't mind going to clients with you. I wouldn't mind talking to customers with you. I wouldn't mind working with or for you during the context of the day-to-day. And that also kind of blends into number two. I'm trying to assess whether you're actually interested in working with me and, the broader organization that I represent. And that's it. It's really not that complicated. I'm trying to figure out, would I like working with you, and do you actually want to work at my organization? That's it. And with that in mind, it's worth also realizing that an interview isn't meant to be kind of an oral reading of your resume. I'll get people sometimes that will come in and they'll just do a verbal dump of everything that's on their resume. They'll talk nonstop for 20 minutes and basically just recite everything that ever happened in your life. That doesn't convince me that, number one, I want to work with you, or number two, that you want to work in my organization. So the first big tip I'll give you in acing your interviews is, don't think of this like auditioning for a role in a movie. If you think of an actor doing an audition, they're trying to represent somebody that they're not in order to get a part in a theatrical production. And that's great if you're an actor. The ability to do that is amazing and obviously lucrative for people that are quite good at it. In terms of interviewing for a job, too many people go in with a mindset that I need to fit myself into a narrowly defined box that this company has created through this job requisition. And they'll tailor their resume, they'll tailor their stories, they'll tailor their behavior during the interview to what they think I want to hear. And on one hand, if you're successful at that, much like the actor, you may get the part. But unlike the actor where, that job is a few months and then you can go on to doing the next thing, presumably whatever job you're looking at is hopefully going to extend beyond a few months, potentially into years or potentially into the rest of your working life. So what I would suggest is go in and be your best professional self. Don't show up looking disheveled, but don't try and make yourself into something that you're not. And that does a few things for you. Number one, it hopefully gives you a better chance of long-term success of that organization, but it also makes you shine during your interview. You are probably best at being yourself versus trying to be someone else. And usually that comes across. When you tell stories, when you speak to the interviewer, when you talk about your experiences, if you're thinking, hey, let me share the best version of myself versus, hey, let me try and work this into what I think the other person wants, it's probably going to come across a lot more effectively. It's probably, you're going to be a lot more passionate and a lot more knowledgeable by just simply conveying the best version of yourself versus what you think I, as the interviewer, want to hear about you. Related to that, one important thing to remember and carry through this whole process is that just as much as I'm interviewing you, you're interviewing me and the organization that I represent. Too many people go into their job interviews and the overall job search, frankly, kind of looking at the interviewer and the potential job candidate as Caesar, sitting up in the amphitheater while the people fight the lions down below. And at the end, Caesar's either going to give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I think that's the wrong way to think about this process. Think about the job process like you're engaging in a mutual relationship. Just as much as I'm interviewing you for a role, you're interviewing me in the company to make sure there's a fit. Not only is that going to give you a little bit more confidence and let you feel like you have a say in this overall process and you're kind of an equal participant at the table versus somebody that's being battered around by forces outside your control, it's also going to, I think, make you a more effective interviewee. You're going to ask more interesting questions. You're going to probe a little bit if you're actually conversing with me and trying to figure out if you want to work with me and my organization. You're going to represent yourself well if you are interested in ultimately creating this relationship. And you're just going to feel a bit more control over the whole process if you feel like you're making a decision just as much as the other entity on the other side of the table is making a decision. I think you'll also, if you find yourself in the happy position of getting multiple offers, you'll really think thoughtfully about how do I make the best decision for myself versus going with, whichever offer comes first or whichever one offers the most compensation or something like that. The next tip I'll give you is have some interesting stories about your experience. Again, you're not here to give me a recitation of your resume and, prattle off every experience that you've ever had. Instead, think about some interesting stories. And in this case, just like a good story, you would tell your kids or you would, see in a movie or something like that, less is more. It should be compelling. There should be some sort of drama involved. And, if you leave out a few details or you tell me the 20-second version instead of the 20-minute version, better that the audience, in this case, me as the interviewer, is saying, oh, tell me more, what happened then? I can sit here and say, hey, in, 1999, I had my first job for some consulting company. I did this, technology stuff. I sat there and banged on the keyboard. Or I could say, for my very first job, one of the funny things about it was one of my initial roles was having to buy candy. And you'll say, and then I just stop there and you say, buy candy, what the heck is that all about? And I can tell you this whole interesting story about why I was tasked with buying candy as a reasonably intelligent recent college graduate. But things like that can make the interview much more interesting for the interviewer and the interviewee. It can really bring some life and some color and some interest to your resume, and it makes you a memorable person. At the end of the day, if you're doing one of these mass interview sessions where somebody's talking to 10 different people, those stories are what sticks out in my head. It's not the fact that you got a 3.75 GPA and someone else got a 3.74. It's that you had a really cool story about that, time you dealt with a customer who was, throwing something at you because they were so unreasonable or whatever. If you're not sure what stories to tell, test them on friends, test them on family or colleagues. Look for the same reaction you get to any story. Before you kind of throw up your hands and say, hey, I'm not a storyteller. Every human being pretty much is a storyteller. When you come to the office on Monday or when you see a friend that you haven't seen in a couple weeks, what do? You tell a story. Hey, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. You just started telling a story. You don't have to be professionally trained. You don't have to be an English major. You don't have to have published books or all that nonsense. You're a natural storyteller as a human being. So this should be well within your range of capabilities. I would have a good, 3 to 6 canned stories that you've worked on. You've kind of thought through what's the plot, how do I put some humor in there if that's natural to you, how do I make this interesting and exciting, and how do I make it very concise and pithy and leave somebody wanting more. A few ideas for stories you should have. One of them would be, tell me about what you're most proud of in your career academic experience. Another might be, tell me about the most challenging problem that you've ever solved. Tell me about a time you've dealt with a difficult colleague or boss or customer. And that one, you can have a good human relation story that you could apply to multiple of these questions. Another one that I've had asked of me that threw me for a bit of a loop at a time was somebody asked, tell me what you're world class at doing. Or a variation on that is, when people talk about you, what's the number one skill they identify? One of my favorites, and if you have a couple or 3 stories around this, you can repurpose them quite a bit, is tell me about a time that you failed. Obviously what you want to do is, turn that failure into a learning experience or something that you grew from. Make these honest and heartfelt and again, use those to establish a rapport with the person interviewing you. And if you do that really well and you can get, 1 or 2 winner stories, and as you do more interviews, you'll see the reaction and you'll see which ones work, you can actually do this really effective technique of turning the roles around in the interview. So if I tell you, if you're interviewing me, I tell you this amazing story, you're on the edge of your seat, I leave out enough details that you're wanting more, all of a sudden, I'm directing the course of the interview. You're saying, oh, what happened next? And then I give you a little nugget of information, and then you want to know how that fits in. And now I'm directing the flow of this interview, and I can send it wherever I want, and obviously send it to a place that makes me look as desirable and as wonderful and as much of a person that you want to hire as humanly possible. The other key tip I'll give you is come to an interview with specific, interesting, and potentially probing questions. Major red flag for me when I do an interview, I always make sure I save time for questions at the end, is if we get through all of my questions and I say, hey, let's open up the floor. Do you have any questions for me? And you kind of look around, you're like, nope, all good. That's an absolute red flag for me. Why is it a red flag? Because it shows you either didn't do any research in my organization, which means you really don't care about this actual job, or you're just, a sloppy person who's not very curious and not very thoughtful. Both of those things are pretty bad. So, if anyone ever asks you, hey, do you have any questions? Even if you've done 700 interviews with this company, you intern there, your father or mother is the CEO, and you know every single thing about them. If someone asks you if you have any questions, just make something up that's at least shows that you are interested enough to continue engaging in the conversation. You should also make sure your questions reflect that you've done at least a very basic amount of research on the company. I've had a few people when I've said, hey, do you have any questions? They've said, what does your company actually do? What are your products or services? Again, that's another red flag. That's a question you could have answered yourself with 4 seconds on the Google machine. If you're not willing to do that just very basic amount of research, you're probably not somebody that I want to hire, quite frankly. The question and answer piece also gives you a very important chance to assess whether this is a company you want to work for. I'll always ask people things like, what do you really enjoy about working for this organization? I'll ask them, if you could change one thing about the organization, what would it be? I'll ask them, what don't you like about the company? Early on in my career, one of the companies that was in the top of my list, I asked somebody, what don't you like? And they sort of started out and they said, everything's pretty good. And then they went into this 5-minute diatribe about how terrible the travel was, and they were leaving their newborn at home, and the company was just absolutely unreasonable on when it told people they needed to travel. And they got dropped from my list. That was a massively valuable data point. And if I had gone to work for that company who ultimately gave me an offer, I don't know what would have happened. So, use that to assess the company, use that to find out if it's a place you want to work. And, also use that as a chance to gauge the interviewer's passion about the work they do. And if they're like, I don't really have anything, we kind of do this stuff day to day and it's whatever, and I collect my paycheck and go home, that's a good data point for you. Similarly, if, the job advertises remote work and that's something super important to you, or conversely going into an office is super important to you, ask them, hey, how often do you go in the office? Or, how's the remote work policy been for you specifically? And try and tie it back to that individual, and you'll get away from the, the company line that's published on the website, and you'll get to some real answers and some real talk, and that's valuable information for you as a potential candidate. That also gets the interviewer engaged in conversation, and again, lets you kind of control the direction of things. You did an okay-ish job in the beginning portion of the interview. If you ask that interviewee a lot of interesting and compelling questions and get them talking, people love talking about themselves, so you may end up turning a lukewarm assessment of you as a candidate into a very positive assessment. You can use those questions to draw out that person, get them engaged, and leave them feeling really good about your interaction together. And that could be a little thing that helps get you over the edge if you're kind of on the cusp. So from a practical perspective of how you start to apply some of these tips, the obvious pointer is practice. Any new skill, you're going to need to run through it a couple or 3 times, and I would look at job interviewing as just another skill that you add to your toolbox. If you haven't done a lot of it because you're newly entering the workforce, or maybe you're looking for a job after 10 years of doing something else and you're a little rusty, take the time to practice. And that practice, there's a range of options. There's plenty of people that you can hire and pay to help coach you and to go through a bunch of practice interviews. That may be a good option for you. if you're worried about the cost or commitment of something like that, try and find what I would call like a second-degree family member or friend that's in a role at a large company and does interview. Even if they're in an absolutely different industry, even if you have no interest in their company or whatnot, call them up and say, hey, would you mind doing some practice interviews with me? If there's somebody that enjoys interviewing and somebody that's reasonable, they'll probably say yes. And the reason I say look for that second-tier friend or second-tier relative is they're probably going to be a little more honest with you. You don't want to have your partner or best friend do a practice interview because they're probably going to worry about hurting your feelings and they're probably going to sugarcoat whatever feedback they give you. So you want somebody that's a little more honest. The other super low-cost way to do some practices is set up a camera, much like this, and practice doing a job interview. It can be a little weird because it's obviously a one-sided interaction. Go take some of the sample questions I gave you, go hit the Google machine and get some sample interview questions, read the question, and then look up at the camera and give a response just as you would if you were speaking to a real human. If nothing else, this is going to help you find any verbal tics you have. Maybe you do a lot of ums and ahs and hemming and hawing. That can be distracting during an interview and is something worth working on. You can hear your stories and how you present them and see your body language and some of that. And obviously it's not going to be perfect since you're looking at a machine versus a real human, but it should at least get you in that zone of telling stories, refining stories, working on your speech patterns, your pauses, all the sort of tactical things that you need to have tuned up and ready to go to start your interview process. The other option, and I don't see as much of this going on these days, is you can ask for an informational interview. This is where you go and ask a company, hey, can I talk to you? I'm not looking for a job, and you've got to make sure that's explicitly true. So I wouldn't necessarily go request an informational interview from a company that you're legitimately interested in because that can be a little bit disingenuous. But this might work if you are an intern somewhere, if you have a contact or a family member that works for a company that maybe you're not interested in, but you'd like to speak to somebody that regularly interviews people just to get that practice under your belt. You may be able to find affinity organizations that you're part of that can help you with practice interviews, and that could be your school. Even if you're an alumni, a lot of schools will open up their career office to alumni and let you do practice interviews. It might be some organization you're part of. If you're a veteran, there's several organizations that will help you with your job search and help you with interviews. There's probably somebody there or some element of that where they can help you with your job search, and as part of that, help you with some practice interviews. The final practice-related tip I would give you is apply to some kind of meh jobs, and this works better if the economy's good and there's a lot of openings. Alternatively, if you're getting hit with recruiter inquiries via LinkedIn, say yes to a few of those. Do a few job interviews and go through the process with organizations that you're not that excited about, and that'll kind of build that interview muscle. It'll let you test some of your stories, and ultimately, you go through an end-to-end process. What might be nice at the end of that is if you get an offer, even if you don't want to work with that organization, that's a pretty big confidence boost that you show yourself, hey, I can go from end to end of this process and ultimately be successful. Final piece of advice I'll leave you with is this is a long game. Like anything worth doing, interviewing for a new job is not something you go out and do one rainy afternoon and then you're all done with it. I would sit down if you're serious about changing jobs, or if you're in school and you're kind of going for your first job and you're serious about a particular industry, and mentally prepare yourself for some big numbers. I would get mentally prepared to fill out 100 job applications, and I would get mentally prepared for 6 to 9 months of interviewing, of sending out applications, of going through this whole process. Get yourself mentally ready for, hey, this is a second job you're taking on, and you should mentally prepare yourself, hey, I'm gonna send out 4 applications every week, and I'm gonna shoot for 2 or 4 interviews every month. And I'm kind of mentally fastening my seatbelt that I'm taking on a second job for the next 9 months until I find a new job. Or, maybe you block in some time to assess after 3 months, and maybe you find out that the job market's not what you were expecting, or maybe you find out your current job is pretty awesome versus what's out there, or maybe you find out, hey, I need to reskill myself or do something. So, look at it as a job, set yourself goals, set yourself benchmarks, and look at it as you're looking for a new relationship with an employer just as much as they're looking at hiring you as an employee. Don't turn this into some sort of judgment that life is either passing you as someone who's a good, productive human, or if you're not getting the offers you expected, that you're somehow a deficient human. I've got to play the numbers game, I've got to play the long game, and part of what I discover might be that I need to redirect my efforts. So with all that said, hope that helps. Again, remember, this is not a one-way relationship. Think about that the right way, get yourself some stories that you can tell, have some good questions in your pocket that you can ask, and engage in a conversation with the interviewer, and best of luck. I know this is a hard process for anyone, whether it's your first big job you're trying to get out of school, or whether you're an old, wizened, gray-haired beast like myself and you're trying to figure out what's going on at some point in your life. So best of luck out there, be well, good luck at the interviews, keep practicing, and this is the Big Heavy, as always, wishing you much success and peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.